Welcome in to the latest episode of the College Football Podcast. Week 3 is upon us. Predictions are here. Not that last weekend was sleepy by any means, but look at the matchups we have. Texas A&M at Notre Dame. We got Clemson going to Georgia Tech. Georgia at Tennessee. Big one there. Got Wisconsin and Bama. Arkansas, Ole Miss. USF, Miami. Florida at LSU. Vanderbilt at South Carolina. Teams on upset alert. Sharks are everywhere. But boy, we're in for a big weekend of college football. So without further ado, let's get into some of these predictions. Going to start today in South Bend, Indiana. Texas A&M at Notre Dame. This is a 6:30 p.m. night game on NBC. Now, we all know Notre Dame went to College Station last year. Mike Elko's first year came out with the victory there from Kyle Field. So, roles are reversed this year. Mike Elko going into his second year. Marcus Freeman, what is this? His fourth year, I believe. So, both teams in different places, but still very similar teams. What is Texas A&M? What is Notre Dame? Like I said, very similar. Both teams want to control the line of scrimmage, run the ball, and pass when they can. Or I guess a better way of saying that would be pass when advantageous, be opportunistic in the passing game. But both teams have the personnel to play the game that way. So who's going to do it better on Saturday? Both teams, they have big offensive linemen, especially Texas A&M, very veteran offensive line there. They have more, to replace on the defensive line as compared to the O-line. Notre Dame returning some starters from the O-line last year. They're more veteran there than they are on their D-line. So kind of similar makeup there. Notre Dame, returning some, replacing some pieces in the secondary. A&M, they brought in some through the portal, but the core of that secondary group is still there. A&M's got some good linebackers that are veteran linebackers, so very similar across the board. Obviously, the running backs probably going to be the story of the game. At least that's the expectation. Got Le'Veon Moss and Reuben Owens on the Aggie side, with Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price on the other side at Notre Dame. So big matchup here. The loss to Miami for Notre Dame and the wins over UTSA and Utah State, they mean nothing for this game, by the way. But Notre Dame showed that they have fight, and they will fight till the bitter end in that loss at Miami. CJ Carr may be green, but he's very talented and probably one of the more mature quarterbacks that are debuting this season, especially whenever you compare him to, Arch Manning, whenever you compare his performance against Miami to Arch's against Ohio State. They're both green, but CJ Carr, he just looks a little more refined there, which, is not what I would have expected, but at least that's not to say that he's not prone to making rookie-style mistakes that can cost a game, because he is, like I said, still green just because you looked good, and that's something that comes with quarterbacks that are inexperienced in game is, you may look good week 1, even in a loss, and then week 2, it's like everyone expects a linear progression, but, it goes up and down. It can go down week 2. Not saying it will, I'm just saying let's not be surprised if the performance isn't what we expect out of CJ Carr. Texas A&M, though, the interesting thing about A&M here is it's kind of a sign of who kind of knows what's going on and who doesn't whenever you look at the commentary on A&M's first 2 games. So I'm just going to get this out of the way. A&M, the first 2 games, there's some questions about the defense, question about the run game on both sides, the run defense and the run offense, because they barely ran the ball in their week 1 game against UTSA, which, like Notre Dame, they didn't do much against Miami on the ground. And, the run defense, things like that, they just looked questionable at times. So the thing you need to understand about Texas A&M is coming into these first 2 games, for better or for worse, Texas A&M was treating UTSA and Utah State like scrimmages. A&M's 1, 2, and 3 teams had near equal reps, which means that, that's a scrimmage. They had 1 scrimmage in fall camp because they were planning to treat the first 2 games as kind of scrimmages to ramp up into this Notre Dame game and then into their bye week. So for better or for worse, whether you like that approach or not, that's the approach that they went with. And it showed at times. That's a little bit of the explanation for why there was, some misfits or missed assignments here and there, is because they're, splitting equal reps amongst most all of their players. They want to get their young players reps. They want to get, a rotation, firmed up and set for that starting rotation. But it wasn't like A&M's ones out there getting gashed on the ground by, UTSA. That was, a true freshman who'd never played before that missed an assignment or missed a fit at the line. So things like that, that's sort of, that's why you're seeing, that sort of play there. So what did they learn overall? How will they develop? The younger players, you're not going to see more, so much of them throughout the rest of the year in the bigger games, but their ones and the twos that are going to rotate in, how can they develop, learn, what can they take from, essentially those first two scrimmages, all due respect. But Texas A&M, the offense is more dynamic and explosive this year than last based off the first two games. That's something that they really emphasized in the first game is they didn't run the ball a lot because they're trying to, get the new receivers in, get them, comfortable in the system, get them comfortable with Marcel, get them valuable reps and, with live bullets flying. So that's, why they didn't run the ball a lot week one, especially is because they, went in with more of a passing game plan. And Marcel Reed, that development in the passing game that we all kind of wanted to see, needed to see, from his, work this offseason as compared to last year, looks a lot better, a lot more accurate with the ball, looks a lot more polished than he did a season, prior. He's not exactly, I don't think he's met his ceiling yet. I guess I'll say it this way. I don't think he's met his ceiling yet as to what he can be, but I think he's going to continue to progress, and all arrows are kind of pointing up there for Marcel. Obviously, he's put on some weight, but still very dynamic in the run game when he scrambles, and, their RPO and all that, they're going to, it's going to be live and well still. Obviously, the running backs that they return, Moss and Owens, the veteran O-line, it's a big advantage for any team, but, similar to Notre Dame, A&M has that in this game too. The D-line has talent. I'm sure everyone saw the 3 plays back-to-back-to-back sacks from Cassius Howell. He was a big offseason, guy they were touting over there. So the D-line, they're replacing some guys that went to the NFL, but they're still, talented. They have 5 stars rotating in. They've got, Cassius Howell. I think he was a transfer from Marshall, I believe. He was there last year, but this year he's going to be starting, coming off the edge. Looks like a very good player. So I don't think that they're going to, miss those guys from last year too much, although it's hard to not miss some guys that went to the NFL. But same with their secondary, Will Lee, he looks pretty good. Des Ricks, who they got, former 5-star that they got from Alabama, looks like he's improved a lot. So the secondary is going to have to hold up a lot in this game because I think CJ Carr is going to be able to deliver the ball accurately, especially if Notre Dame's run game gets going. So huge game for the coaching staff at A&M, huge game for the players to show that this program is headed in the right direction. A&M has big game potential. They, have big wins here and there, but this is the first win of the This is the first game of the season that they have an opportunity to legitimately win and kind of announce their arrival this season, in the sport of college football. It's not the end-all be-all. Whether they win, whether they lose, it's not the end-all be-all. They still have a lot of games to play, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. But it would be a pretty impressive win, and then they have a bye week. Going into the bye week 3-0 with a win over Notre Dame for Texas A&M could be huge. I think the AP has them ranked 16 right now. That'd probably vault them right around the top 10. Headed into a bye week, and that's a really good case scenario for the Aggies in this one. But Notre Dame, talented O-line, obviously. Running backs, like I already mentioned. The imported wide receivers, the guys they got from the portal, they've looked pretty good so far. CJ Carr looked pretty good against Miami, even in the loss. I think that this is probably the one hole that A&M has the advantage over Notre Dame on, and that is the quarterback position. All due respect to CJ Carr, like I said, great quarterback, but I just think Marcel Reed, the reps he's got last season, the development he's shown, I think that Marcel Reed is probably the advantage here for the Aggies. That's not to say, though, that CJ Carr, especially on the stat line, can't best Marcel Reed. I just think that with the way the defenses are going to have to prepare for the quarterbacks, I think that Marcel Reed is just going to present a bigger challenge for Notre Dame than CJ Carr will. Now, if Notre Dame's O-line is impenetrable, if the run game is going, then he's going to dice you up. So the Aggies really need to get pressure here. They have a hard, Notre Dame, their defense is, they play hard, they play scrappy. Can they contain Reed in the run game? Because I think that while I say that Marcel Reed's passing game has improved, if they're forced to be one-dimensional, I don't know. I think they can beat you through the air. I just don't know in this game if A&M's, I don't know if their firepower is enough to beat Notre Dame's defense, who I still have some questions about, by the way, but just kind of the way that they've played ball the last couple of years there, it's just going to be a pretty, it's going to be hard to do. I'm not saying the Aggies can't do it, but it's just going to be hard to do. Throw in a night game in South Bend on top of that, I just think that that's kind of why I lean Notre Dame in this one. I think that A&M, they have a very real, legitimate shot to win the game, but Notre Dame, night game at home, tough defense, pretty, good quarterback. And the teams are pretty even, so it's really hard to kind of predict this to see into it. But with teams that play pretty even, overall, I'd say I'd give the lean to the home team, Notre Dame. I think they'd get a fairly comfortable win here. They're favored by 6.5, so I could see like this game being close, kind of like last year, being close, being a hard-fought, scrappy game for a long time. And then Notre Dame, they just kind of pull away in the fourth quarter. That's kind of what I'm expecting here. If A&M wins, obviously that means I'd be wrong, but I've already touched on what that does for them this season. Notre Dame, if they win, that's kind of your big 1-2 games that you split coming into the year was Miami and A&M, and it's like if you can at least split that, then you probably give yourself a pretty good shot at returning to the playoff. But if you lose this game, then I think that definitely becomes questionable. I tend to believe that if Notre Dame goes 10-2, even though they lose the first 2 games and start 0-1, hypothetically, I think they probably still make the playoff because especially with the way that they look at teams late in the year, and so I wouldn't be too worried either way if I was a Notre Dame fan. But if you do lose this game, then I'd probably circle that USC game. I'd probably circle that Arkansas game. I don't think Boise State's going to threaten you like we thought preseason, but you have 2 more games I'd say to worry about, regardless of whether you win or lose, but especially if you lose. So I'll take Notre Dame to win. Not going to bet on this game. Don't have a great feel for the points either way, but I will take Notre Dame to win. All right, moving on. Another big game to look at. Conference races in the balance early in the season, kind of. Clemson at Georgia Tech. This is an 11 o'clock game. So the first question I have about this is, what is Haynes King's status? I don't have a definitive answer yet because it's just they haven't put it out there yet. So I don't have a definitive answer. It does sound like he will play. So there is that. It does sound like Haynes King will play. Aaron Philo, he probably gets the start otherwise. That's who started last week. Put up good numbers against Gardner-Webb, but this isn't Gardner-Webb. This is Clemson. So if Haynes King is back, then all, favorability swings a lot farther towards Georgia Tech than it already has. But Clemson, can you run the ball in this game if you're Clemson? Because you couldn't against LSU. And with Antonio Williams still being day-to-day, I'm a little concerned if you can't run the ball. Not just for this game, but for the rest of the season. And especially if you find your way into the playoff, you're not going to be able to make the run that you want if you can't run the ball. And like I said, Antonio Williams, if he's still day-to-day, if he doesn't play, even if he does play, is he going to be limited or is he going to be full go? So questions there for Clemson. Can you contain Georgia Tech if you're Clemson? Because I think Georgia Tech is kind of willing to do some things play calling. I think their play style and the play calling wise, they're willing to do some things that Clemson just isn't. And it's just schematically the difference there. And so I think that because of what Georgia Tech can do and is willing to do, that I think that's kind of an advantage. Haynes King will die on that field if he has to, figuratively speaking, of course, for his team. But, and And part of that is because sometimes that, he has to play like that. But like I said, schematically, that's one of their strengths. So the keys to this game, did I say game? The keys to the game for Clemson, you have to make Georgia Tech one-dimensional. If you take away the run or if you take away the passing game, it's going to be, hard for them. It's obvious, but it's going to be hard. I don't think that Georgia Tech has the Jimmies and Joes if they're made to play one-dimensional, I don't think they have the Jimmies and Joes to be able to overcome that. In Georgia Tech, how well can you resist that push by Clemson to make you one-dimensional? Because if you can resist it enough, then I think that you can win. But whoever wins that battle is going to win this game, I think. But I am calling for the upset here. I think that Georgia Tech is primed and ready for this, this year. I think this is their year to kind of really pop, have a great season. So I think that they upset Clemson and they get the game at home. This point spread opened at 6.5 for Clemson. It's since moved down to 3.5. So I'm taking Georgia Tech here. Again, probably not going to bet on this one, but I am taking Georgia Tech for the upset and to win this game. Make sure you like the video if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, follow the podcast, leave a pretty 5-star review. Follow me on Twitter if you want, by the way. I post some pretty cool graphics there. It's just a way to kind of stay in touch with what I'm up to. But, Campus Pigskin is the Twitter handle. But thank you for listening to this show, by the way. I really appreciate it. But speaking of the state of Georgia, this game will not be played there, however. 2:30 ABC, Georgia at Tennessee. Who do you trust more to put a perennial winner on the field? Kirby Smart or Josh Heupel? If you're asking me, my answer is Kirby Smart. Not because Josh Heupel's a bad coach, but just because that's what history has told us. Although Kirby Smart obviously has the, edge tenure-wise. It's not that simple, though, obviously. Who do you trust more offensively, Mike Bobo or the Heupel offense? Probably Josh Heupel, if you're asking me. What about the defense? It's tough because Tennessee, they're really good on defense, but I think I just kind of lean, in Georgia and Kirby Smart here. So because of that kind of even split, it makes this, that's why this game is hard to predict. Both of these are really good teams. The way that we've seen these first 2 weeks, the way Tennessee has played, it's just kind of unfair the way they so seamlessly, at least in these first 2 weeks, were able to replace Nico after he left in the spring. Just kind of feels unfair, not going to lie. They were supposed to have a down year, and maybe they will. But this game will obviously show us how good they are. It'll show us a lot about both teams. I think Tennessee for sure, though. Because if Tennessee goes and they beat Georgia here, like I said, it's unfair. It's unfair to be able to replace your quarterback that well. So not complaining, just pointing it out. It is what it is. If you did it, you did it. Congratulations. You're a hell of a coach, which I think Josh Heupel is a pretty good one. But sure, the way they blew out Syracuse and, ETSU, it doesn't prove anything other than Tennessee, than what we thought preseason about them is probably wrong. Because I kind of expected them to come out and struggle a little bit against Syracuse. They didn't. They blew them out. Didn't expect them to struggle against ETSU, and, they blew them out. But so what we've been proven so far is that at least Tennessee is better than we thought preseason. How good are they? Are they good enough to beat Georgia? What is their ceiling? Because even if Tennessee loses this football game, I still think that we're going to be able to kind of get a better feel for what their ceiling is based on how it's played and how well they play. Georgia, on the other hand, do they have holes? Because last year there was kind of some glaring holes on Georgia's team, specifically in the run game offensively. And Carson Beck just didn't, play up to the level that he was expected or capable of. Obviously, injury had some stuff to do with that, but it was just kind of a, off down year for Carson Beck. But if they have holes, where are they if you're Georgia? What's the weak link? And is Tennessee equipped enough to exploit them? Especially, I think Georgia, let's see. Defensively, I trust them, but if there's holes defensively, is Tennessee equipped with that, with Joey Aguilar to exploit them? Kind of just repeating myself there, but I'm not sure yet, but we will find out. So this game, like I said, it's going to show us a lot about both team ceilings. not in terms of a final win-loss record or anything, regardless of the outcome. I think strengths and weaknesses are going to be kind of put on full display here. You can't hold anything back if you're either one of these teams. So we're going to learn who's good at what, and that's exciting. But Joey Aguilar, Gunnar Stockton, who's more capable of being the QB that their team needs? And these teams need their quarterback to be different things. I don't think Georgia, especially if they can flip the way they run the ball from last year, I don't think they need Gunnar Stockton to be a gunslinger. As much as he may, like to be or want to be, I think that he kind of is, he's kind of like a Haynes King style quarterback, I think, if you're Gunnar Stockton. That's kind of how, so far into his career playing at Georgia, that's kind of how I look at him. He can throw the ball where he's needed to, but he's going to play physical football. And it may not be great to do that in the SEC, but I think that's kind of, relatively speaking, the style that, you can expect from Gunnar Stockton. Joey Aguilar, on the other hand, I think he seems to kind of be a little more dynamic so far. They pass pretty well, but, the story with Tennessee the last couple of years has been in their running game. So, like I said, can these QBs be what they need, what the team needs them to be? I think they can, based off of what I've seen so far. And the thing is, though, Georgia has to play what looks to be a pretty dang good Tennessee team in Neyland. And that's a tall task. But there's no one that's more proven probably than the Georgia Bulldogs on handling that task to, as well as any team could. Alabama, with Nick Saban, vintage Nick Saban, obviously, but now Georgia. They're the ones that kind of year in and year out are the perennial contender in the SEC, and it just seems like they're immune from the things that normal teams struggle with. They still have struggles, but they just overcome them constantly. Credit to that coaching staff, obviously. But I think that it may be a cop-out. Maybe it's unfair. I just trust Georgia in this spot. I think Tennessee did a really good job replacing Nico, the position they were put in this offseason. I think they handled it well. It seems like they backfilled and developed extremely well. I just don't know that I haven't seen enough against a proven enough opponent, because Syracuse could suck. I don't care what ETSU is or how good they are. They should handle them like that every time. But Syracuse could suck. We don't know that yet. And if they suck, then that, really kind of takes away from what Tennessee did to them in this regard, because I think that if Tennessee is, a good team, we'll find out. But I just trust Georgia more. So the point spread, what is it? It opened up at UGA 6.5. It's moved. I think it was yesterday down to 3.5, but I just checked it. It's back up to 4.5. So Georgia is favored here on the road in Neyland. Another game that I'm not betting on because I'm a little more conservative earlier in the year on betting, because I just don't fully trust. I don't jump to conclusions super quickly. So I'm gonna take Georgia to win. Like I said, not betting on it, but that number is pretty thin for this being a game in Neyland. So if you're interested, I think it could possibly be an opportunity there. But I'm going to take Georgia to win here. There's some other games I want to talk about, but I'm not going to do a full breakdown on them. So I'm just going to go kind of rapid fire here for a couple of games, starting with Wisconsin at Alabama. So let's just jump right in. This is, a pick. There's, this game, USF at Miami. I think maybe Florida at LSU. I think those are going to be kind of trendy upset alert picks. And for this game, in particular, I don't think that that's going to happen. Although it probably will be, like I said, a popular upset alert pick. But I just don't see it. I think that Alabama is going to kind of flex here and potentially embarrass Wisconsin. But then again, if the competitive profile of Bama fails to, emerge, if they show up and play like they did against Florida State, then all bets are off. But this is a home game at Alabama. Wisconsin, they're just, they're not really going anywhere. It doesn't feel like they have a lot to offer. It doesn't feel like they're going to be able to push Bama. I think that if, Alabama loses this game, all due respect, it's going to be because Alabama lost the game, not because Wisconsin beat them. But I just don't think they have the Jimmies and Joes like Florida State did to upset Bama here. And I'm not saying that Florida State has this crazy talented roster, but schematically, Florida State has a roster that can exploit, I think, some holes in the Alabama defense that Wisconsin does not. And so I just don't think this upset's going to happen. I think Bama's going to win this game easy. I'm going to, probably take the over at 46.5 because I think Alabama's going to put up some points. Last I checked, they're favored by 20.5 points, which doesn't mean anything, obviously, as far as, because that's about what they were favored at going into Florida State. But I think this is going to be a game that Bama flexes. They want to erase that Florida State game. They want to look as good as possible. I'm not going to trust Alabama, though, until I see them play Georgia at least. But still, here, I don't think Wisconsin's good enough to beat them, even if they're down. So, but moving on, Arkansas at Ole Miss. That game against Kentucky last week was pretty interesting and a little concerning to me from the Ole Miss perspective. It didn't feel like they played, they played well enough to win the game, but it didn't feel like they did, if that makes sense. But Arkansas, I don't think they're going to be a great team this year, but I think they are capable of biting some other teams, which, Kentucky's like that. Arkansas's like that a lot, obviously. I think that if Austin Simmons plays like he did at Kentucky, I think that Arkansas can be more, I think they're more equipped offensively to be able to score on you. So if Ole Miss is sluggish because of quarterback play, I think that Arkansas is going to be able to take advantage offensively and score enough points to win this game. So Austin Simmons is going to have to play a clean game here. That Arkansas defense, though, I don't know that they can force him into the same mistakes that Kentucky did. So how does Ole Miss, though, contain Taylor Green? He's a pretty dynamic, quarterback. So passing the ball, he's kind of similar to Marcel Reed, although I think Marcel Reed is better. So if you're an IU listening, don't take that as a slight. I think Marcel Reed is better overall and has been than Taylor Green, but they do kind of have a similar style of ball, similar makeup too physically. So I'm going to take Ole Miss to win here. I think that, if the line's 7.5, which I think that's what the line was, Arkansas covering, wouldn't surprise me, but I'll take Ole Miss to win. And speaking of games that are popular upset picks, I'd expect USF at Miami to be a popular upset pick, although, like I said about Wisconsin-Bama, I don't think it's going to happen. USF, they played a great Week 1 game against Boise, and they upset, Week 1 top 25 opponent, although, Boise without Ashton Jeanty is obviously kind of the cop-out that everyone's taking comfort in there. Then they go on the road into the Swamp, and they beat, which Florida was, ranked 13th at the time by the AP. Just pathetic. But they beat them in the Swamp in Gainesville, and they vault themselves into the top 25, kick Florida right out. So 2 back-to-back weeks of top 25 wins to open up the season for USF. So that's why people are going to look at this and think, Miami, they could get upset this weekend. I don't think Miami is like Florida. I think they're a lot better than Florida. I think Miami is a lot better than Boise State. The way they played against Notre Dame in Week 1, I think Miami is better than most teams in the country. That's why I have them top 5. So I do not think that this upset is going to happen. But if USF wins, first of all, red flags all over Miami immediately. But if they win, should USF be a top 5 team? Maybe number 1? Why not? That would be 3 back-to-back-to-back wins, upsets over top 25 teams, with the 25th ranked team, the 13th ranked team, and Miami is top 5, I think, in the AP. So you would just have back-to-back-to-back linear progression, linear upset wins over teams. I mean, why not? Why not be a top 5 team at that point? What's the argument against USF if they beat Miami that they're not a top 5 team? Maybe number 1. Ohio State, yeah, maybe it's because Ohio State looks really good this year. But if they're a top, if they pull this upset, then it's going to be hard to argue them as not a top 5 team. But like I said, I don't think that the upset here is going to happen. 2 more games, 2 more predictions to get through, and then I've got upset alerts. But Florida at LSU, 6:30 p.m. night game in Death Valley. I think this has the probability of being the best game of the week. Both coaches need a hot start to conference play, especially Billy Napier because of his start to the season. But Brian Kelly, he bought him some goodwill in that week 1 game, that win against Clemson. But, Billy Napier here, he needs this one bad. But spoiler alert, I don't think that Billy Napier's fate is going to be decided in this game, regardless of the outcome. I think this game is going to show me more about LSU than Florida. I feel like I know what Florida is capable of. I think I know what they are. And what they are is they're just not consistent. So my golf game, for example, I know what I'm capable of. Every now and then I'll have just a, killer drive, bomb it down the fairway, or a great iron shot, or you sink a 30-foot putt, something like that. But that's my, highest level of it. The problem is that I'm not consistent at golf. That's why I suck at golf, because I'm not consistent at golf. It's not because I'm not capable of delivering a good shot. It's because I'm incapable of being consistent. And that's what Florida is. They're capable of beating any team in the country, but they're not consistent. So they're also capable of losing to any team in the country. That's what happened last week with USF. So Florida beating LSU would not surprise me at all. Florida getting, just absolutely thrashed by LSU would not surprise me at all. Both outcomes are, equally likely necessarily. Even if Florida won convincingly, I'd have, for example, if Florida goes out and they win 42-17, I'd have no faith in their ability next week to go beat Miami. And, I think Billy Napier's job is just a ticking time bomb at this point. And that's my opinion. I just think that's how it is. But LSU, big win at Clemson. But then Clemson looks bad against Troy, right? So you do against LA Tech if you're LSU. I don't care. So that's more of a question about Clemson to me than LSU. But that's why people are doubting LSU right now. That's why people are doubting both teams, because now they're looking at Clemson and saying, oh, maybe Clemson, if Clemson's not good, then maybe LSU isn't that good because they only beat them by a touchdown. And if Clemson sucks, then LSU, I don't care. I think that both teams could still be really good. Both teams could still be pretty mid. So this game will help us to, kind of figure out which one of those LSU is. So that's why I said I think that this game tells me more about LSU. How they show up, how they play defense. Because even, DJ Lagway didn't have a great game last week, but I think that he'll be, I tend to feel like he's going to be on it this week more so than he was last week. I think they'll have a good game plan. So how does LSU's defense contain him is a question I have. But like I said, don't fully know what LSU is yet. And, the results, the way the game is played last week, I'm not factoring that into my opinion, frankly, at all. But I am excited to learn about the LSU defense, like I was saying. I think Florida's going to have a good, game plan. I think DJ Lagway plays well. So what does the LSU defense look like against a accurate, dynamic, big quarterback like DJ Lagway? I'm curious to find out. And I can't tell you yet, but I think that, if what we saw week 1, assuming Clemson is a good team, is any indication, I think they'll be pretty competitive in that, matchup. But it will be hard to tell at times. I think if the defense for LSU is playing well or if the Florida offense is playing bad, it's pretty nuanced. But, one thing you can't fake is line of scrimmage play. So I think that this game, what does LSU's run game look like is a big question. It's a common thread here kind of lately with some teams. But what does LSU's run game look like against Florida? Because like I said, I think that this is going to just come down to what Florida team shows up this week, because I think Florida can pretty much beat anyone, like I said, but they can lose to anyone. So if Florida shows up and they're good game plan, ready to go, prepped well, and they execute the way that they're capable of, I think that Florida probably wins this game. Well, I say that. It's in Death Valley. There's always that but right there, isn't there? It depends, though, on what LSU's ceiling is. I'm still not convinced. I have LSU ranked very high right now. I think I have them 5th overall. That's based off of talent, coaching, and what they did week 1. Now, if they go and they crap the bed against Florida, I think they're probably going to fall pretty far, because I don't think that they should lose to Florida. I don't think LSU should lose to Florida at home, at night, with the quarterback that they have, with the potentially improved looking defense that they have. I think LSU should win this game just straight up. And I think Florida at best is going to challenge for it, but at worst, I think Florida is just going to be dominated. And so this game opened up at 8.5. LSU favored. Let me pull up FanDuel right quick. Let's see where that line is moved to give you the most accurate line that's out there. It's dropped a point. LSU's favored by 7.5. I just don't think Florida can go into Death Valley at night and get a win. But, a staff and a team with their backs against the wall, you can have some crazy results. Sometimes it can be unpredictable. I just don't have faith in Florida's ability to get up for this game. And like I said, even if they did, I don't have any faith in them going to beat Miami. And maybe we'll get to the end of the season and I'll have 10 weeks of saying I don't have faith in Florida and they'll be 11-1. But in all likelihood, that's probably not the outcome we're going to see this season. So give me LSU for this game. Florida starts the season 1-2 after getting into the season and starting conference play. I think that's where we're going to be at. And the hype meter for LSU is going to be sky high, and the Fire Billy volume in Gainesville is going to, it's at 11 right now. It's going to turn to 12, and it's going to keep turning and turning until that knob breaks and they have a new staff there at Florida. All right, last game to get to before I go over some potential upsets for the week. I'll kind of make this a quick one. Vanderbilt at South Carolina, 6:45 night game in Williams-Brice. One of the most underrated environments in all of college football. This is going to be a fun game. I think that this and the LSU-Florida game are the two kind of like number 1A, number 1B best games of the week. I think this game is just going to be so fun to watch. And, that's kind of why I'm, previewing a Vanderbilt-South Carolina game. So, Diego Pavia, the Diego Pavia effect. I just got done talking about how Williams-Brice is the, one of the most underrated places to play in college football. But if you have a psychopath like Diego Pavia on your team, I think that effect is kind of, it's mitigated, I guess I'll say. I think that the traditional kind of thinking points of, point to a South Carolina win, like if you're going and you're breaking down a game and you're using like normal logic like I would for most of the time, I think that kind of points South Carolina. But I think this is just going to be a highly unconventional game, highly unconventional type of matchup because of the talent that's out there. You've got for South Carolina, that Dylan Stewart in that pass rush. You got Lenore Sellers and Nick Harbor on the offensive side, just freaks of nature. Williams-Brice at night, but like I said, Diego Pavia is a psychopath, respectfully, of course. And whenever you're playing like a psycho and you're calling the game like a psycho, I just think that kind of makes you a little bit immune to that matchup, for lack of a better term. I think that Vandy could get the ball out quick, do some funky stuff back there, and kind of render that pass rush a little bit, useless for lack of a better word. I don't think he's going to be back there as a pocket, as a traditional pocket passer and be prone to that sort of play style. We also have a common opponent, a result from a common opponent. So take that for what it is. In Virginia Tech, both South Carolina and Vanderbilt played Virginia Tech in the first 2 weeks of the season. Vandy obviously had the better outcome offensively. So, take for what it's, for what it's worth. Take it for what however you see that. It's just kind of an interesting thing that makes you, kind of pause for a second. But honestly, though, my gut just screams Vanderbilt. Could be wrong. It's been wrong before. That's why I'm not a millionaire sports bettor. But yeah, it just screams Vanderbilt to me. I just think that they are going to play a style of ball that South Carolina is just, it's hard to prepare for. It's why they are having success right now. And I just don't know that South Carolina overall has, respectfully, good enough pieces and good enough staff to kind of prepare them enough to be able to account for that. And I feel like I'm really putting myself out into open waters here saying stuff like that, but that's just kind of, like I said, I'll be honest, that's just kind of based on gut feel and intuition, I guess. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm made to look a fool by Shane Beamer and company, and if that's what happens, then that's what happens. I'll be fine with that. Congratulations to them if they can pull out the win here. But like I said, I just scream Vanderbilt. Prediction, Vandy wins, obviously. Let's see what the line is, because I'm doing this. I'm scrolling in real time so that we get the most accurate number. But I did look at it last night, and I liked the over. If I could find it here. Oh, that is far out. All right, so we've got Vanderbilt at South Carolina. South Carolina was, where is it? It's not even on FanDuel. Is it? Is it not? Well, I like the over at 49.5. That's what the number was last night. Let me pull it up on ESPN here. I know that this is a very kind of unprofessional way of doing things, but I never claimed to be a professional, so I've got you there if you wanna take shots at me. But South Carolina is favored by 3.5. That's a pretty low number for a home game against Vanderbilt, I might add. Whenever you're ranked 11th in the country, it opened at 5.5. The over under points is still 49.5. I like the over. This just feels like a shootout to me. Vanderbilt plus 140 on the money line looks nice, but yeah, that spread 3.5 at home for South Carolina when you're number 11th overall in the country, and you got Vanderbilt coming to town. That just screams unconventional, and that's exactly what I think it'll be with Vanderbilt winning. All right, wrapping up, super quick segment here. Just upset alert. Teams to watch this weekend. Clemson, you are on upset alert, and the meter is high level potential for an upset there for Clemson this weekend. Alabama, you are on upset alert just because of the competitive nature of your team, and what you showed week 1 is what I'm calling into question. However, I do think the probability is low. Ole Miss, on the other hand, I think you have a high level of upset potential this weekend playing Arkansas. Like I said earlier, everything I said in my prediction in that preview, I think, all of that points to an upset. LSU, medium, because like what I said, Florida, they can beat you, anyone. They can beat anyone. They can lose to anyone. LSU, you're on their schedule. You can lose to Florida. That would not shock me. So upset, but I think you'll pull it out. Like I said, upset level is medium in my eyes. And South Carolina, I think that you are a contender to be upset this weekend big time. Panic meter is high level of upset potential there for South Carolina playing Vanderbilt. But I appreciate y'all listening to the podcast this week. Make sure you follow, subscribe, like the video if you're on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Campus Pigskin. But until next time, thanks for listening to this episode of the College Football Podcast.